Good Monday afternoon, everyone. This is Keir Murray. I'm a Houston-based political and public affairs consultant, and I'm joined for the sixth consecutive Monday by Dr. Richard Murray, a longtime political scientist from the University of Houston, and my father. To all you Star Wars devotees, may the fourth be with you, as we say on this day. Lot going on in the COVID pandemic that we're experiencing. As we do at the top of these discussions, I want to sort of take stock of where we are. As of the most recent data that I've seen, there are about 3.5 million cases globally of COVID that have been diagnosed, about 250,000 fatalities. Here in the United States, we've got about approaching 1.2 million confirmed cases and nearly 70,000 fatalities. It's noteworthy, I think, that the United States has 4% of the world's population, roughly, but we've got about a third of the diagnosed cases and more than a quarter of the confirmed fatalities. We are approaching 7 million Americans who've been tested for COVID-19, which is an improvement over where we have been, but still, for context, only represents about 2% of our population. So long way to go on that front. We've seen some alarming projections come out from the CDC this morning via the New York Times, suggesting that a doubling of fatalities in the US by June 1st may be expected, and a rapid increase in the number of cases upwards, as we're currently diagnosing about 25 to 30,000 cases a day and experiencing 1,500 to 1,700 fatalities a day on average. They're talking about now 200,000 diagnoses a day and 3,000 or more fatalities a day. So, Dad, with those grim numbers, I'd like to have you kick off the discussion, sort of give your assessment of where we are.
Well, the numbers in the last week, I think, on the healthcare front have been disturbing. It's increasingly clear that while we went up the peak really fast, on the backside, we're plateauing out with a high level of deaths and infections. And people like Dr. Gottlieb, again, was on the weekend television, they're not encouraging about this reversing. So we're probably looking at, from our perspective as political analysts, the virus being a major contending force all through the next 6 months before we get to Election Day on November 3rd. And the economic disruptions are just beginning. We added about another 4 million people who formally filed for unemployment. That gets us up to around 30 million. That's more than 15%, but real unemployment is much higher than that. The states are still having real problems processing applications. So we're heading in almost certainly a very deep recession with the continuing healthcare crisis in the background.
Yeah, and Dr. Gottlieb, Scott Gottlieb, who you mentioned, who, for those who don't know, was the Trump administration's head of the FDA for the first couple of years of the administration. I saw follow him on social media, and he was indicating that while he was encouraged to see the drop in the New York and New Jersey area, which have been the hardest hit in the United States, that he foresaw a sort of plateau effect, as you described, for weeks on end, where we essentially see a pretty consistent number of diagnosed cases and fatalities for many weeks to come. I'd love for that not to be the case, but he's certainly seemed to confirm what this Time story leaked out from the administration projected this morning. I also thought it was interesting that President Trump did a sort of town hall style interview last night with Fox News in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. I'm not sure, as a political operative, it was quite the visual they were going for, with probably our greatest president, towering over a much smaller human being sitting in front of the statue. But be that as it may, it is what it is. But even in that interview, the president, who had just a few weeks ago been talking about only 50 or 60,000 fatalities, was now moving the goalposts and revising that upward of 100,000 or more. Again, I think are likely to pass 70,000 today or tomorrow, and I don't see yet indications that this is starting to slow down. I hope we do soon. Turning to the sort of politics of the president, We've seen a number of polls come out over the last week to 10 days that show erosion in his standing, both nationally with voters, where I think Joe Biden has opened up on average, about a 6-point national lead, as well as in key battleground states where the president, in many polls that I saw, has fallen down into the low 40s, danger zone for any incumbent president seeking reelection. What's your assessment of what this has done to the president's reelection prospects, at least as we sit 6 months out?
Well, I think the last week has been damaging. The little bit of a bounce that the president got back in the end of March, early April is totally dissipated. And you just have a lot of bad news locked in, as from where I sit, for the next 6 months. We're going to have horrendous unemployment. The stock market bounces around. It's hard to predict it, but the healthcare crisis looks like, again, it's a constant. It's going to remain a major problem. But unemployment's bite is just, I think, beginning to filter out to the people that say haven't necessarily lost their jobs, but their own economic standard of living is going to be dramatically reduced because there's just so much less purchasing power in our country. And people, to the extent they have money, are going to tend to hold on to it. And so even if you've got a job, you're probably seeing a real greater amount of stress than you perhaps thought possible, given what's happening in the broader economy.
Yeah, and you mentioned this rally around the flag bounce. We've talked about that a couple of times previously. Ezra Klein, a pretty well-known progressive national observer of politics, wrote, I thought, a pretty interesting piece in Vox 3 or 4 days ago, trying to get at why the president's rally around the flag bounce was low to begin with and so quickly dissipated relative to governors and even leaders in other countries, and incidentally relative to leaders who got a slow start responding to this virus, like Boris Johnson in the UK, like Governor Cuomo in New York, who I think received some criticism on the front end for being slow to react to this crisis, but who then became much more aggressive and had seen a much greater rallying effect for their support from the residents of their countries and respective states. And the argument he makes is that the president missed an opportunity to unify the country, and that virtually any president in American history prior, and what leaders in other countries and in states in the U.S. have done, is to rally their publics around fighting this virus, getting through this crisis. And to me, as a political operative, inexplicable reasons, the president did not do that, and I think has greatly weakened his own political standing in the short term and perhaps the long term by failing to do so. What's your sense of that?
Exactly. This is a crisis wasted by the president, particularly to not take advantage of the opportunity that was hugely available to reach out, to be a unifying, consoling figure. I thought over the weekend when he had retreated to Camp David, and you had this national live streaming for several hours with lots of messages, including one from George W. Bush talking about it's time to unify the country the way we did after 9/11. And the president, without needing to say anything, went out of his way to condemn George W. Bush, attack him, to say, why weren't you helping me unify the country when this fake impeachment was going on? Well, there's still, a fair number of Republicans and independents that think it might be a good idea to reach out to a former president in this moment of crisis, but Trump totally rejected that, just blew it off. And, it reflects his continuing huge bet that what is emotionally satisfying to him, that is preaching to the choir, to the hardcore, that he finds so gratifying emotionally, is a good election strategy. That's highly, highly risky because his base has never been bigger than 44 or 45%. And it's right about that right now. In an election where I think virtually everybody's going to vote for or against Trump. There's not going to be much third party voting in 2020. 44 or 45% is not going to get it done. You've got to get some additional folks.
Yeah, and there was a pretty lengthy piece in the Washington Post over the weekend kind of talking about the president's response and his unhappiness with how this has played out politically for him. I noted that last night during his Fox News appearance, claimed he'd been treated worse than President Lincoln, who paid the ultimate price for his presidential leadership. Continues to be interesting. But one of the things that the Post piece pointed out was that a lot of his reluctance to listen to his advisors and either curtail or discontinue these lengthy presidential briefings that were going on for a period of weeks was that he just was convinced that they were this is what people wanted to hear, that they were behind him, and when the data from polling and other places sort of belied that, I mean, I think it was like more damaging to him than anything else, which is no doubt why his advisors were telling him to knock it off. This wasn't a good idea for him or other Republicans down ballot who were starting to sweat about their prospects in November.
Yeah, the president, of course, didn't start running for public office until 2015, but he was a television celebrity. And that kind of business where if you get a 20% market share, that's wonderful. But in a one-on-one general election, just playing to your base audience is probably not a very good strategy. But he still thinks, well, I'm getting all this free media coverage. Yeah, but the content of that coverage is not impressive to people that are not already part of the Trump base.
Right. And let's turn to Joe Biden for a minute. I mean, relatively speaking, in terms of the campaign and due to obvious circumstances surrounding this crisis, he's kept a relatively low profile. As we've discussed a couple of times in the past, these allegations from a former staffer, Tara Reade, have picked up some speed over the last week or two. More information coming out over the weekend, not dispositive one way or the other, but in my own sense is perhaps injecting more doubt into her claims, changing stories, going back and saying, well, I'm not sure I did file a complaint, and even if I did, it won't have any of this in it. And then, she canceled a TV appearance on Fox News, which ostensibly would probably have been a fairly friendly interview context for her. So, what do you make of the sort of this toward Tara Reade issue and where it is and how it's likely to affect the race going forward?
Well, it's obviously not helpful to the Biden campaign in the short run. But I continue to think in terms of the last couple of months, Biden's been such an extraordinarily lucky person in terms of timing that, he was on the ropes in late February, and a week later, he was the clear front runner and difficult to stop. He just blocked up the nomination before the COVID virus shut down the whole process. Then, for example, these allegations of Ms. Reade, if they had come up when you had 3 or 4 viable Democratic candidates running against Biden, 2 or 3 of whom were women, this could have seriously derailed his process. But none of this, of course, came to light until it was too late to affect the Democratic process. If he were running perhaps against Mitt Romney or a sort of a Boy Scout opponent, these charges might have some traction, but if ever there's a so's your old man type situation with Biden perhaps having some questions about his own conduct toward women, that's not a dog that's going to hunt very well in a race against Donald Trump. So it looks to me like, based on what we found out in the last week, these charges are out there. They've been investigated. The idea that there's any cover up by the New York Times is ridiculous. The Times have put a lot of resources into investing. But they've also called for Biden to open up his Senate papers that are housed at the University of Delaware. I think he would be very foolish to do that based on what we know today. That's a raw material of great volume. It would take weeks to go through it. And that's the kind of continuing story that can be exploited in a campaign like Hillary Clinton's email. So from a perspective of a campaign person, I would say tough it out. It doesn't look like this story's got enough substantive merit to seriously change the trajectory of the electorate. It's going to stay out there. People will consider it, but there's a lot of bigger stuff afoot than a 27-year-old accusation that seems, maybe it has some merit, maybe not, but there's, as you say, it's not dispositive.
Yeah, just again, kind of putting my operative hat on. I mean, I tend to agree with that. I thought, Biden took some flack for being pretty quiet about this over the few weeks prior to making doing an interview that was with Mika Brzezinski on Morning Joe that I think most people thought was pretty tough. She went at him, but it seems to me that um, they were able to get organized and get their ducks in a row on how to respond to something like this. I also think if you're their campaign, you much rather have this happen 6 months before the election than 6 weeks before the election. And one thing that occurred to me that we saw some of the Obama administration officials come out and point out that, before he was selected as Barack Obama's running mate, Joe Biden was extensively vetted in that process, as all vice presidential potential selections are, and that there was not a whiff of any of this that came to light. He's also someone who's run for president twice before, once before after this accusation, this allegation supposedly took place. And while Biden does have some history of conduct that perhaps has made women uncomfortable, touching their hair, that getting a little too close, that sort of thing, I have not seen anything that sort of extended to this level of misconduct being alleged. So I think all those things in total make me agree with you that I'm not sure this is likely to be a major issue on which the campaign is prosecuted in the fall. But we'll see. We'll just have to see what else, if anything, comes out. One thing I wanted to turn to was this notion of our various states and how they're responding. We've talked about this somewhat before, but I thought Dan Baltz wrote a very lengthy and interesting piece in the Washington Post yesterday talking about how governors around the country have sort of jumped into the breach and seized the reins in trying to respond to this crisis, largely because of a vacuum created by the administration in Washington and just not a proactive stance on intervening in this crisis on particular issues. And I thought the interesting thing about the piece to me was the fact that the power of the presidency has been steadily growing since Franklin Roosevelt, years and years ago was in office. And that while President Trump likes to talk about his ability to control things and his absolute authority, that in practice, he seems reluctant to use it. Yes, he's made some executive orders on immigration and other issues that have, had mixed success in the courts. But absent that, in a situation like this, where active leadership, where you're going to be on the hook for your decisions, no matter what you do, he seems reluctant to get involved. And then thus we have this very disparate response going on in various states. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast. I think I've mentioned before, Teddy Roosevelt famously said, speak softly and carry a big stick. Trump speaks loudly and carries a small stick. He really doesn't have much of any follow through. There's a lot of bluster, a lot of noise, threats sometimes, but particularly in dealing with this crisis across all 50 states, basically he's largely said, you guys solve it. It's your problem. If it's testing, if it's opening or not opening, it's balls in your court.
Yeah, and you and I in a private conversation talked about this. We've got, it's not ideal, of course, and there are huge consequences to how this plays out, but we've got an interesting situation where we've got different states proceeding differently in terms of how they're responding to this crisis, what sorts of measures they're putting into place or not putting into place, that I think may, in several weeks or months' time, give us some interesting data back on what the quote unquote right course of action was. How do you see that in terms of, different governors in different states responding to this in their own ways, and what we might be able to glean from that later on?
Well, generally, if you look at the pattern of the pandemic, which most of the infections apparently came from Europe into the Northeast, the New York metropolitan area, and that's been dominant in terms of new infections and deaths. But now they're leveling off, particularly in New York. But in the rest of the country, we've got a whole bunch of states where the infection rates are going up and deaths are going up. Texas is one of those states. And as we're seeing moving out into the broader country, we have a lot of these hotspots that are related to, you've got a lot of people in the meatpacking industry, for example, that work in very, very close quarters, long hours, hard conditions, and now are at an alarming rate getting infected. So that we've lost 20, 25% perhaps of our pork processing, 10% of our beef. And of course, that's not a New York City problem of riding the subway. It's that we jammed workers in side by side under tough conditions, and a lot of them are getting sick, including in the Texas Panhandle, which is one of the largest meatpacking centers in the country. So this is a very uneven quality. The state that reported the first case, Washington State, has been relatively stable. But now Southern California, Los Angeles is seeing a surge of cases. So it's a very complicated environment. There's a story in the Times today looking at nations. You have countries side by side where in Indonesia, it looks like millions of people have died, and next door in Malaysia, hardly anybody. So there's just a lot of things we don't know about this virus yet, but we sure know that it's very uneven in its impact across our 50 states.
You know, and again, I don't mean to sound cynical or like I'm treating this lightly, but I mean, it almost goes through my mind that the administration or some folks politically have made the calculation that we're not going to be able to stop spread of this virus or fatalities. And so the really only practical course of action politically is to just let this play out and try to restore some sense of normalcy, particularly on the economic front, to stave off what could be a tidal wave wipeout in November for national Republicans. I mean, that's just me speculating, but I'm wondering, like, this notion of, have we just have folks, the powers that be as such in Washington, have they just decided that we're going to go the way of Sweden, but we're just not really going to talk about it? I mean, that I'm almost left wondering if that isn't the decision that's been made.
Well, that's effectively what we did in 1918. We got a surge in the spring, died off. There was the national government. President Wilson was mostly focused on fighting World War I. It's left up to states to deal with it. Some did pretty effectively. Then when it came back in the fall, it killed 650,000 people. So there's a very high risk to going Sweden. They have between 5 and 10 times as many fatalities as Norway and Denmark. You know, I think we would have been at risk of having a repeat of what happened 100 years ago, that you'll eventually get herd immunity, the virus will fade, but, you know, if it fades with 2 million dead, that's an awful price to pay. And in 1918, many more Americans lived in the countryside, smaller towns. Now we're very urbanized. Our economies have become incredibly more interconnected. So the Swedish way may not be the smartest way to go.
And, you know, again, I just to delve a little bit more into the political risk here, since that's what we're here to discuss, is that, I mean, I think about states like Florida, of course, which is sort of the ultimate swing state, right, in the United States, most closely contested going back years of any in the country. But additionally, places like Georgia and even Texas that have become more competitive in recent years, all states where the president has quote unquote friendly governors in office. This strikes me as a big gamble, that if, you know, you could potentially be putting states on the table like Georgia and Texas if this goes poorly, and I hope it doesn't, that might not have been otherwise. Vis-a-vis the presidential race, U.S. Senate contests, races for Congress, and control of legislatures, like the Texas House here. What do you think? What do you think about that risk versus reward calculation?
Well, some projections nationally now have the Electoral College potentially a landslide for Biden, because a whole bunch of states that weren't supposed to be in play now appear to be, like Georgia and maybe even Texas. We've had 4 or 5 polls in the last 3 weeks that show Texas to be quite close. And we also, of course, have this, besides coming a little bit late to the COVID crisis and now getting into the middle of it, we have this free-falling economy, particularly centered on the oil and gas industry, that's going to hit us much harder than any other state. So the map is changing. It's very fluid. We still have the sort of 6 clearly identified battleground states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, possibly Ohio, Florida, of course, North Carolina, and Arizona. But hey, we may have another 6 or 7 states that weren't supposed to be close, all coming into play.
Which ostensibly could put control of the U.S. Senate in play. I think something most analysts, observers thought was possible but not likely 2 or 3 months ago. Again, from my vantage point, looks like is getting more likely, and barring some change in trajectory, economically, public health wise, or both. Not a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination, but a possibility. That's got to be spooking Mitch McConnell and other folks in Washington.
A couple of points in that regard. You know, a 57-page memo prepared by the Senate Republican staff was sort of warning Republicans, don't spend a lot of your time in running for the Senate defending the president. Just talk about China caused it. But also we see Mitch McConnell pushing hard to get the senators back in, because I think he feels we've got to continue to deliver on approving Trump's appointees, and particularly judges, because that gives us, of course, the play, as one would expect, to the evangelical Christian base vote, because they have benefited enormously from President Trump and the Senate Republicans. But this may be the last hurrah for them. And, you know, McConnell is really pushing to get everybody confirmed if possible, because, you know, if you lose the presidency and or the Senate, that game is over. And there's now the possibility of both.
Right. You know, turning to Texas, you know, we've seen some back and forth here, sort of a smaller scale version of what we talked about nationally, with different governors doing different things. Here in the state, we've had some back and forth between the governor and some county executives, including Lena Hidalgo here in Harris County, as well as some others. Abbott also getting flack from his right, somewhat directly from Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, his nemesis across the Capitol, but as well Montgomery County, a suburban county north of Houston, also happens to be the county where the lieutenant governor resides. I thought it was interesting late last week, their county judge comes out and says, I'm opening everything up all the way in Montgomery County. None of this 25% business in restaurants, and we're going to do hair salons and gyms and the whole 9 yards. He was slapped down by the governor. But, you know, governor experiencing some of his own political difficulty in this situation. And then we've got this ongoing unresolved issue of the mechanism of voting that you and I have discussed a couple of times in the past, but we keep coming back to because it's far from resolved, and it's, of course, enormously important. We've got litigation where a trial court judge has ruled that voters considering fear of COVID can be considered a disability, which would allow expanded voting by mail. The Attorney General, Ken Paxton, has refuted that and has said, you know, and voters and or third parties who send people mail ballots who are not eligible for them could be prosecuted. Doesn't say shall be prosecuted, but says could be. Where do we stand with this? Where's this headed here in Texas and nationally?
Well, first, the courts, of course. We have the state lawsuit and a preliminary decision by the trial court in Austin saying that it's reasonable to claim fear of the virus as a disability. That's going to be appealed. We've got a separate case in federal court arguing things like, well, giving people of a certain age qualifying for the ballot in an important election is discriminatory, violates the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection of the Laws provision. I think both of these cases will be resolved, unlike Wisconsin, before Election Day. So hopefully, minimally, we know what the rules are, and the people that are responsible for carrying out the elections, county level officials. But it seems to be, first locally, the Commissioners Court approved, $12 million in additional funding for a very vigorous vote by mail program in Harris County, where 15% of all the votes in the state. I think across the state, many other election officials are planning a lot more voting by mail this year because the lines could be horrendous in October, November, in early voting and election day. So first, let's see what happens in the courts. I think the judges realize this Wisconsin thing was a disaster, and you got to move this along. It's 6 months to the election, but realistically, it's 60 days until the local officials have to put in place the way they're going to run the election. So we've got some time, but not a hell of a lot to get these issues resolved, not only for the benefit of election officials, but for voters. We need to know what the rules are, and many people are saying this is the most important election of my life, and I really want to vote, but under what conditions?
Yeah, I think that's right. And as we've talked about before, I think, that obviously this isn't relevant in federal court where judges are appointed and have lifetime appointments and don't stand for election. But vis-a-vis the state case, which may ultimately end up in the Texas Supreme Court, I think we can assume it will. I've had experience with a lot of judicial campaigns over the years, and my sense is that these folks are not immune from worrying about what voters think. And as we saw in Wisconsin, the electorate punished the state Republicans and both the Supreme Court and the legislature for their decisions regarding the election. There's no reason to think that couldn't happen here in Texas. And so I think that has to be in the back of their minds. Some of these Supreme Court justices are up for election this fall. I think going into this cycle, probably most people didn't think it was terribly likely many or any of those seats would be competitive. But I don't think one can make that assumption anymore, given everything that's going on. And as you said, given the polling we've seen just in recent days coming out of Texas, I don't think you got a slam dunk for reelection statewide as a Republican that you've had for the last 25 years. It probably maybe, but not guaranteed. So I've got to think that's factoring into their thinking.
Just imagine a scenario. I live around the corner from Fiesta, which is an early vote station, and early voting is where lately most Texans have cast ballots. We typically, particularly in the last week, have pretty long lines there. What if the line's a mile long? Which is quite possible. I think it may take the average voter 8-10 minutes to cast a ballot this year with no straight ticket voting, very long ballot. You have to go through every race if you're going to follow the ballot down. Then you can politic up within 100 feet of the polling place. So if you have 2,000 people outside, somebody might be out there saying, "Why are you standing in line here today? Why didn't you vote by mail?" The firefighters, I thought, worked the line very effectively at Fiesta back during the election last year. The judges might be the target of that kind of campaigning because people are stuck there. They're registered voters. They're interested. What better time to hit them with a last-minute campaign message? Say, vote those guys out when you get inside.
Right. That's it. Stranger things have happened. We've got a few questions here that I want to turn to. They're coming in via chat. So someone asked, beyond the allegations against Biden, how do you think his campaign is being conducted vis-a-vis his visibility, activity, et cetera?
Well, it's hard to separate out what they would have done under normal conditions as opposed to being locked in the basement. Partly because Trump has been so dominant and not necessarily to his own benefit. Biden's kind of gotten a free pass here for the last few weeks, but that they've got to get out of that gear. You can't run this whole campaign from the basement in Wilmington. A lot of what's going on is probably not visible to most of us. It's behind the scenes negotiating. It's putting together your campaign team, raising some money. But there's a whole bunch of areas, like David Axelrod had co-authored a piece yesterday that the Biden campaign has been very, very slow in digital advertising. Mm-hmm. And that was Trump's ace in the hole in 2016 and figures to be even more so this time. So they've got a whole bunch of areas they need to ramp up fast. It seems to be they probably will have sufficient financial resources. Democratic candidates running for Congress seem to be raising a hell of a lot of money. I would think that some of that would also be reflected in Biden being well funded. But he's an old school politician, and he can't do old school. So let's see how he adapts to this new world, not only of digital campaigning, but where you can't do the traditional press the flesh, getting out and mixing people and so forth.
And a lot of that, it seems to me, is about the team you put around you and empowering them to do their jobs. There are plenty of smart people out there who know what to do. It's just you got to put them in charge and let them do it. So we'll see if Biden does that or not.
Well, you know,
Um,
he ran for president twice, but he didn't get very far. So we don't
right.
have much information about how Joe Biden functions in a competitive campaign because he never really had one when he was running for the Senate after he first got elected. And again, we learned nothing from his presidential campaigns because they didn't make the cut and go deep.
Yeah, very true. Another question. Why do we have such a large proportion of the world's COVID-19 cases? And then sort of other question, is there any likelihood that the Democrats would drop Biden in favor of another candidate?
Very difficult to do the second part because he's gotten these pledged delegates. I mean, he would have to, the only person who can drop Biden is really Biden if for some reason he withdraws. But these delegates were picked by the Biden campaign, and all the other folks have dropped out. So yeah, I mean, there could be a health crisis or a more severe political scandal, but basically, you know, very, very likely he will remain the Democratic presumptive nominee and then the nominee. On why so many cases in the U.S., good question. We thought we had the world's greatest healthcare system in perhaps New York, perhaps was even prouder, and that system totally collapsed under the weight of cases. I think a couple of things. We lost several weeks that were vital when we could have perhaps contained this virus, and we failed to. Then it was trying to manage it, but that's managing it without clear national direction across 50 different states that are responding in different ways. You know, people move around a lot. They were particularly moving around a lot in February and March when this virus spread. And by the time we finally realized what the hell was going on, the horse was out of the barn.
Yeah, yeah. Um, a few weeks ago, we saw long lines of people lining up for food here in Texas and elsewhere. Is there accurate information about how serious this situation is? My sense is it's quite serious and likely to get worse. But
Yeah, you can spin a lot of things, but you can't spin hunger. People aren't getting the food they and their families need. They know it. You know, you realize it several times a day. Uh, the you know the food chain has been somewhat disrupted, but the main problem is people don't have the money to buy food in the market economy, and it looks like to me that's going to be a huge problem for the next weeks and months. So you know, that was of course one of the enduring images of the Depression. People in line to get food, some of them very well dressed, that clearly were coming from occupations that they didn't ever expect to be in a bread line. And I think we're beginning to see that again, that people are driving up in expensive cars and, you know, looking to get a bag of groceries through the window.
yeah, and my own sense is that, you know, while some of this early stimulus was, I think, not perfect, it probably has had a real effect on softening the blow in the short term. You know, increase what is it, $600 a week extra in unemployment that people can receive for a couple of months. So, it seems to me, absent some further intervention by the federal government, that aspect of this crisis is likely to get acutely worse. The more people who once that assistance runs out. So we'll see. Hopefully that will motivate the elected officials in Washington to, you know, be thinking about further steps that need to be taken. Thoughts on Biden's vice presidential pick and why the emphasis on selecting an African-American woman when his support seems so strong in this portion of the Democratic voters? This is a question that was posed.
I think this is the most loyal segment of the Democratic coalition, particularly African-American women. In 2016, Clinton's unexpected defeat was closely tied to underperforming in Black neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee. If you reverse those three states, you get a very different election result. So it makes some sense to look at, you know, the African-American voters are going to vote overwhelmingly against Trump and for Biden, but will they turn out? They didn't in 2016. Putting a Black woman on the ticket would probably address that. But again, you don't worry about losing any appreciable percentage of that vote. It's going to remain heavily Democratic. You do worry about getting white working class voters back in those same states where Black turnout killed Clinton in the cities. But you have candidates like Klobuchar that have demonstrated strength outside the cities. And so, you can make a pretty strong persuasive case for her as a nominee that could restore the blue wall. If nothing else, we know Joe Biden is going to approach this with more care, perhaps, than any presidential candidate in history, because he knows he's 77 years old. He's frankly admitted he may well be a one-term president. And he understands that win or lose, the person he selects as his nominee is now the presumptive front runner for the next Democratic round. So it makes this vice presidential nomination terrifically valuable. Important, of course, for the election itself, but you're putting in line a very possible first woman president of the United States.
Yeah. And I noted that the campaign said that they're considering a dozen or more potential candidates through their vetting process. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. We have a question asking to talk about the Texas Senate race, both the runoff and the Democratic primary, and then the general election, and whether or not John Cornyn is vulnerable. My sense, I'll quickly say, I think he is vulnerable. He's, as you pointed out in the past, he's not as disliked as Ted Cruz is in the state, but he's also not as well liked by the Republican base. He's not well known, despite being in office statewide for 20 years or so. I think the challenge will be twofold. One is the delaying of the primary runoff hurts the Democratic nominee in terms of time to prepare a campaign for November. Maybe that's offset somewhat by the change in circumstances due to COVID. The other, though, is expense. We are a massive state, 29 million people, 16, 17 million registered voters, 20 media markets. To run an effective statewide campaign in Texas is very, very expensive. And again, with federal campaign contribution limits, you can't raise money in massive chunks as easily as you can running for a state office like governor. So I do think he's vulnerable. I think to some degree, we're going to have to see whether the Biden campaign and or other forces like Michael Bloomberg decide to get involved financially in Texas, either through the presidential campaign or other means. But what's your sense of how the U.S. Senate race looks?
Well, we've had some more state polling in the primary. A lot of voters are undecided there in the choice between Senator Royce West from Dallas and M.J. Hager, congressional candidate who ran a strong race in Central Texas. But it looks like Hager has got a pretty substantial lead. That probably means she's going to be the nominee. In Democratic primaries, women fare pretty darn well these days. Against Cornyn, she was a pretty good fundraiser in her congressional race, but she's got a lot of ground to make up. Cornyn doesn't have an enormous war chest, but he's pretty well funded. He's been a senator for 17 years, and before that, attorney general. But he's not particularly popular. And most importantly, is how does Trump run? If Trump carries the state, then I think Cornyn is absolutely safe because he ought to run a couple of points better than the president. But if the president gets into real trouble here, and there's some suggestion that may be coming, then Cornyn's vulnerable. He's at risk. And to a great degree, when you have a presidential candidate like Trump, it's really hard to separate yourself from the president.
And my observation is he hasn't tried. I mean, I follow his public statements pretty closely, and he's all the way on the president's team in terms of his rhetoric and the things that he's talking about. To some degree, this suggests to me someone who hasn't had a competitive race in a long time. Maybe he's right and he just thinks he's got it in the bag, but I don't know that I'd be too sure about that. We'll have to see, but I'm keep waiting to see him pivot to more of a general election message that's designed around motivating independents, suburban women, that kind of thing, the voters that he needs to stay in his camp in order to ensure his reelection. I haven't seen that yet. Maybe it's coming.
His last competitive race was his first for statewide office against Jim Maddox in 1988 for attorney general.
Yeah.
They've all been cakewalk since.
Question from Ellen Cohen. Is there a universal deadline for states to decide whether a state will use mail-in ballots, and how many states presently use voting by mail? I think the last part of that you touched on earlier, but you may want to just repeat it. But
5 states do nothing but mail ballots, mostly in the West. 27 have a mix, and they're moving toward more mail, less in person. For the remaining states like Texas, there's no uniform rule, except that some of the federal laws, like getting ballots out overseas, mean you've got to have your election process basically set up and running about 50 days out. So that's kind of the absolute deadline, and you've got to get ballots printed so they can go overseas. So, but there's no national rule, except that the federal election says soldiers or other people stationed abroad have to have this window, and those ballots have to be mailed out, well, probably around the 15th of September.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't go, really Labor Day would probably be about the end of where you could do any kind of change.
So under 3 months or 3 or 4 months. Yeah. Someone asked, what about the extra debt being taken on by the U.S. as an issue in the campaign? $3 trillion or in that neighborhood in the second quarter, maybe more to come. Do we think that'll be an issue in the election? My view is no, it won't. But what do you think?
Justin Amish runs as a libertarian, he could try to make it an issue. But how are the Republicans and the Democrats going to run against each other on that? They're all voting for it. Right. This is not your father's Republican Party anymore. Look, instinct for self-preservation. If you don't rescue this economy, the Republicans are going to get wiped out, and the markets can't do it. You simply have to have massive governmental intervention, and of course you have a Republican president who always said in his private, "I love debt," and he's gotten a marvelous opportunity to add to it in his 3.5 years.
Yeah. Two more and then we'll wrap up. What grade would you give to the mayor, county judge, and other elected officials locally here in the Houston area in handling the COVID crisis so far?
I'd give them pretty good marks. I think Turner and the county judge made the right move in shutting the rodeo down early. That's had something like 10 more days to go and could have really given us a kind of New Orleans Mardi Gras disaster if it had run on into deeper into March. They've been pretty aggressive in trying to follow the public health side of this debate, not reopen business as fast as possible. That's popular, I think, with urban voters. Most people have largely complied with things like social distancing and staying at home. Now that the weather's getting nicer, that'll be harder to do. But if I had to assign a letter grade, probably be B+ for the county judge and the mayor.
And then finally, someone asked why our governor hasn't been more aggressive in getting more testing for our state. Texas consistently ranked near the bottom, right, of the 50 states, and 48th, 49th, something like that.
Well, when I write or say anything about Governor Abbott, I rarely include the word aggressive. He's passive. That's his style. It's served him to this point well. He's very good at keeping his head down within his own party ranks. He has to worry about the Tea Party folks who really, they're more in the Dan Patrick corner. But he's avoided a serious primary challenge in his positions. Now he's having to pivot to also worry about the general election as Democrats are becoming more of a credible threat. So his style and his inclination is avoid controversy, try not to alienate any particular segment of the electorate, both within the Republican Party. And, so far he's pulled it off pretty well. But that's just not Abbott and aggression. I don't think that's his style.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we wrap up there for today? Thanks everyone for joining us. And I'll be putting these on the YouTube channel. We have, if you search Murray Men on Politics, I think you can find it. I think this will be our 6th installment, and I don't know how much longer we'll be doing these, but as long as we're stuck at home, why not, right? So anyway, Dad, thanks for chatting, and we will talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.